Under relentless attack, the carrier refused to die, driving through fire and falling aircraft.
April
held together
1st,
by willpower.
1945. Easter Sunday, off the coast of Okinawa. American naval officers watched something that defied every law of naval warfare they knew.
Cathedrals of war.
A Japanese Zero carrying 550 pounds of high explosive slammed into HMS Indefatigable at over 300 miles per hour.
On the open sea,
The Kamikaze pilot had chosen his moment perfectly. The British carrier was crowded with aircraft, preparing for launch. Fuel lines were pressurized. Ordnance was armed. This was the exact moment of maximum vulnerability. American liaison officers braced for catastrophe because they had seen this movie before. USS Franklin lost 807 men from bombing attacks just 2 weeks earlier. USS Bunker Hill would lose 396 sailors to 2 kamikazes next month. When a kamikaze struck an American carrier, it meant 6 months in a repair yard. Sometimes it meant the ship would never fight again. But 37 minutes after the Zero exploded on Indefatigable's flight deck, the first sea firefighter landed safely. The carrier was back in action. An American officer aboard ship watched damage control teams sweep burning wreckage overboard and fill the crater with concrete. He turned to his British counterpart and said something that would become legendary in naval history. When a kamikaze hits a United States carrier, it's 6 months repair at Pearl Harbor. When a kamikaze hits a limey carrier, it's just a case of sweepers, man, your brooms. The question everyone was asking was simple. How the hell were British carriers surviving attacks that would cripple American ships for months? The answer lay not in superior seamanship or better damage control, though both were excellent. The answer was 3 inches of hardened steel that one obscure British admiral had fought to install against every objection the Admiralty could throw at him. This is the story of how one man's insane idea to armor aircraft carrier flight decks changed naval warfare forever. 1939. The Mediterranean Sea. The Royal Navy faced a problem that was killing ships and men at an alarming rate. British aircraft carriers were operating in narrow seas within easy range of enemy land-based bombers. The Mediterranean, the North Sea, the English Channel. These were not the vast expanses of the Pacific where American carriers could run and hide. British carriers would be found. They would be attacked. And they were dying. HMS Courageous was sunk by a German U-boat in September 1939 with 519 men lost. HMS Glorious was sunk by German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in June 1940 with 1,207 men lost. HMS Ark Royal survived multiple bombing attacks before finally succumbing to a torpedo in November 1941. The pattern was clear and terrifying. British carriers were too vulnerable. Royal Air Force doctrine held that the bomber will always get through. Fighters could not intercept every attack. Carriers needed something more than speed and maneuverability. They needed passive protection. They needed to survive hits, not just avoid them. The Admiralty's solution was more fighters. Better tactics, improved anti-aircraft guns. Everything except the one thing that might actually work. Nobody wanted to armor the flight deck because everyone knew it was impossible. Enter Rear Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson. Born in 1881, Henderson was not a flashy officer. He was not a tactical genius like Nelson. He was not a beloved leader like Jellicoe. He was a quiet, methodical engineer who had commanded HMS Furious and served as Rear Admiral aircraft carriers before becoming 3rd Sea Lord in 1935. Henderson was the kind of officer other officers found boring. He obsessed over technical details. He read engineering reports for entertainment. He believed that mathematics and metallurgy would win wars, not heroism and tradition. The Admiralty barely tolerated him. But Henderson understood something his colleagues did not. In an era before effective radar, before proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, before jet fighters that could climb to intercept bombers quickly, carriers could not defend themselves with weapons alone. They needed armor. Not belt armor around the hull like battleships. Not turret armor like cruisers. They needed the flight deck itself to be armored. 3 inches of hardened steel protecting the entire flight deck. This idea was considered absolutely insane. The objections came from every direction. Naval architects said it was structurally impossible. The weight of armor on top of the ship would make it top-heavy and unstable. It would capsize in rough seas. Aviation experts said it would reduce aircraft capacity to uselessness. The armor weight would displace so much tonnage that carriers could only embark 30 or 40 aircraft instead of 70 or 80. Fleet admirals said it would slow the ships down. Heavy armor meant less power available for speed. Carriers needed to be fast to launch and recover aircraft and to evade attacks. Tradition-minded officers said it violated the fundamental nature of aircraft carriers. Carriers were offensive weapons, not defensive fortresses. They should carry maximum aircraft to strike the enemy, not hide behind armor like cowards. The criticism was universal and brutal. Henderson was mocked in Admiralty meetings. His proposals were rejected repeatedly. Senior officers suggested he was too old, too conservative, too stuck in the battleship mentality to understand carrier warfare. But Henderson had one advantage. He had watched HMS Furious operate in the Mediterranean during the Abyssinian crisis of 1935. British carriers exercised under threat from Italian air power. The vulnerability was terrifying. One hit from a bomb could penetrate the thin wooden flight deck into the hangar where dozens of aircraft sat fully fueled. The resulting explosion would destroy the ship. Henderson saw this vulnerability firsthand, and it obsessed him. He began working in secret with naval architect W.A. Forbes to solve what everyone said was an impossible engineering puzzle. Build an aircraft carrier where the flight deck itself is armored. 3 inches of hardened steel protecting the entire flight deck. Make that armor plate serve as the ship's strength deck, the primary structural element carrying the hull's bending loads. Surround the hangar with 4.5 inches of armored bulkheads. Create an armored citadel that could survive 500-pound bombs dropped from 7,000 feet. Forbes was brilliant. Several alternative designs had to be worked out before I could get a fully armored carrier of 23,000 tons, Forbes later explained. And one of the main secrets was that the 3-inch armor plate, which formed the flight deck, was used both for protection and longitudinal strength. This was the breakthrough. By making the armor structural, it served 2 purposes simultaneously. It protected the ship, and it held the hull together. The weight penalty was manageable because the armor replaced weight that would have been needed for structural steel anyway. Henderson presented his final design to the Admiralty in late 1936. The reception was ice cold. "You want us to build carriers that can only embark 36 aircraft instead of 72. That's suicidal. We'll be outnumbered 2-to-1 by any enemy carrier force." Henderson's response was simple and devastating. How many aircraft can a carrier at the bottom of the Mediterranean embark? 0. How many aircraft can a carrier under repair for 6 months embark? 0. A carrier that survives with 36 aircraft is infinitely more valuable than a carrier that sinks with 72 aircraft. The logic was irrefutable, but the Admiralty still resisted. Building armored carriers would require abandoning the existing design programs. It would mean admitting that all the carriers currently in service were fundamentally flawed. It would mean betting Britain's naval aviation future on one man's untested theory. The debate raged for months. Henderson worked himself to exhaustion. He attended endless meetings. He produced calculation after calculation. He refined the design repeatedly to address every objection. His health began to fail under the stress, but he refused to give up. Finally, in April 1937, the Admiralty approved construction of HMS Illustrious. The design process that normally took 3 years was compressed to 3 months because Henderson had done most of the work already in secret. The keel was laid at Vickers Armstrong Barrow on April 27, 1937. It would be the first aircraft carrier in history with a fully armored flight deck. But Henderson would never see his creation prove itself in combat. In March 1939, his health completely collapsed from overwork-related illness. He resigned as 3rd Sea Lord and died just 2 months later at age 57. The man who would save thousands of British sailors' lives died before his carriers ever faced combat. The Admiralty gave him a proper funeral and promptly forgot about him. His obituaries were brief and formal. No monuments were erected. No ships were named in his honor. Rear Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson was buried in an unremarkable grave, and history moved on without acknowledging what he had accomplished. HMS Illustrious was commissioned on May 25, 1940. France was collapsing. Britain stood alone. The new carrier looked strange compared to American and Japanese carriers. Its flight deck was shorter. Its hangar was fully enclosed rather than open-sided. It could only carry 36 aircraft compared to 90 on USS Yorktown or 84 on Japanese carrier Shokaku. Critics said Henderson's design was already obsolete. Then, on January 10, 1941, Illustrious faced its first real test. The carrier was operating in the Mediterranean, supporting operations against Italian forces, when German Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers attacked. 10 Stukas dove on the carrier in a coordinated assault. The attack was devastating. 6 1,000-pound bombs hit the ship directly. The explosions were catastrophic. The aft flight deck elevator was destroyed. The after hangar was wrecked. Fires broke out throughout the stern. 126 men were killed. But the armored flight deck held. Not a single bomb penetrated into the vitals of the ship. The armored box protected the machinery spaces, the magazines, the fuel tanks. Illustrious maintained power. It maintained steering. It fought its way to Malta for emergency repairs. Naval experts who examined the damage were stunned. Any unarmored carrier would have been sunk or permanently crippled by 6 1,000-pound bomb hits. Illustrious was back in action after 2 months of repairs. Henderson's insane idea had just saved his first ship. Over the next 4 years, 3 more armored carriers joined the fleet. HMS Formidable, Victorious, and Indomitable formed the core of British carrier strength. They fought in the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the Arctic convoys. They took bomb hits, torpedo hits, near misses that would have destroyed unarmored carriers. They survived. But the real test was still coming. In late 1944, the British Pacific Fleet was formed to join American forces in the final assault on Japan. 4 armored carriers would operate as Task Force 57 under American command. Their mission was to neutralize Japanese airfields in the Sakishima Islands during the invasion of Okinawa. They would suppress enemy aircraft before they could reach American forces. It was a dangerous assignment because Japanese kamikaze tactics had evolved specifically to destroy carriers. The Divine Wind had perfected their technique attacking American carriers. They knew exactly where to aim. They understood what happened when bombs penetrated wooden flight decks and exploded among parked aircraft full of fuel and ammunition. They had sunk 3 American escort carriers and crippled multiple fleet carriers so badly they never fought again. The kamikaze strategy was working. American blood proved it. But nobody told the Japanese pilots that British carriers were different. Nobody explained that 3 inches of armored steel could not be penetrated like American wooden decks. The kamikazes were about to discover that everything they thought they knew about attacking carriers was catastrophically wrong. On Easter Sunday, 1945, at 07:28 hours, the first kamikaze struck HMS Indefatigable. 2 Seafire pilots scored cannon hits on the Zero as it approached. The aircraft began breaking apart mid-air, but its momentum carried it forward. It looped over the carrier and dove toward the flight deck, hitting on the starboard side near the island structure. Captain Quentin. Dick Graham watched the impact from the bridge. The explosion was enormous. A massive fireball erupted from the point of impact. Burning aviation gasoline splashed across the flight deck. 14 men were killed instantly. The pilot's briefing room was demolished. The sick bay was destroyed. Lieutenant Commander Pat Chambers, the flying officer, was killed at his post. Lieutenant Leonard T., the air engineer officer, died trying to fight fires. Dr. Alan Vaughan, a Canadian surgeon lieutenant, was killed treating wounded men. The damage looked catastrophic. The flight deck was depressed 3 inches over a 15-foot area. Metal was torn and twisted. Equipment was destroyed. Fires burned everywhere. American liaison officers watching from the island expected the worst because they had seen this exact scenario destroy American carriers. They expected secondary explosions. They expected fires to spread through multiple decks. They expected the carrier to withdraw from combat for months of repairs. None of that happened. The armored deck held. The 550-pound bomb detonated on impact against 3 inches of hardened steel instead of penetrating through to the hangar, where 36 aircraft waited fully fueled. There was no massive secondary explosion. There was no chain reaction of bombs and torpedoes cooking off. There was no aviation fuel fire spreading through multiple decks, consuming everything in its path. The damage was terrible, but contained above the armored box. Below the armor, the ship was untouched. The machinery spaces were intact. The magazines were safe. The fuel tanks were secure. The ship maintained full power and steering. Damage control teams went to work with brutal efficiency. Lieutenant Commander Sandy Sanderson, the flight deck engineer, jury-rigged a replacement crash barrier from spare parts. Chief Petty Officer Jimmy Green controlled a small hangar fire using the ship's revolutionary foam suppression system. Teams swept wreckage overboard. They filled the crater with quick-setting concrete mixed on site. They tack-welded steel plates over the damaged area. They worked with desperate speed because aircraft were returning from strikes and needed somewhere to land. At 08:16 hours, just 48 minutes after a kamikaze carrying 550 pounds of high explosive had slammed into the flight deck at over 300 miles per hour, the first Seafire fighter landed safely on HMS Indefatigable. The carrier was back in action. American officers could not believe what they were seeing. This was impossible. This violated everything they knew about carrier damage, but the evidence was right in front of them. British damage control teams were already painting over the repair area. Aircraft were landing and launching normally. The carrier continued combat operations throughout the day without interruption. One American liaison officer turned to his British counterpart in complete disbelief. Just how? The British officer smiled and tapped the deck with his boot. 3 inches of good British steelmate. That's Henderson's legacy. The American had never heard of Henderson. Nobody had. But he was about to witness Henderson's genius prove itself again and again over the next 5 weeks. Because the kamikazes were not finished. They were just getting started. And British armored carriers were about to demonstrate survivability that would seem like science fiction to anyone who had not witnessed it personally. The divine wind was about to meet its match in 3 inches of steel that one forgotten admiral had fought to install against every objection the Royal Navy could throw at him. But this was only the beginning. Indefatigable had survived one hit. Could it survive sustained assault? Could the other carriers match this performance? And what would happen when kamikazes struck carriers that had armed and fueled aircraft spotted on deck during launch operations? Those questions would be answered in blood and fire over the next 5 weeks as British carriers faced attack after attack after attack. In Part 2, we'll witness HMS Formidable take 2 kamikaze hits in 5 days and remain operational. We'll see HMS Victorious absorb 2 kamikazes in 6 minutes. We'll watch HMS Indomitable survive 3 kamikaze attacks in 10 minutes with 0 casualties. We'll see American officers throw their hats on the deck in disbelief as British carriers refused to die, no matter how many times they were hit. And we'll discover the dark secret that nobody knew during the war. The hidden flaw that meant these seemingly indestructible carriers were actually dying slowly from the inside, even as they appeared to shrug off damage that would destroy American ships. Henderson's genius had created the most survivable carriers ever built. But had he also created ships that could win battles, but not survive the peace? Rear Admiral Henderson's armored carriers had just passed their first test. HMS Indefatigable took a kamikaze hit that would have crippled any American carrier and was back in action in 37 minutes. The 3-inch armored flight deck had worked exactly as designed. But one success does not win wars. 4 British carriers were now operating in the most dangerous waters on Earth, facing an enemy that had perfected the art of killing carriers. The Japanese had sunk 3 American escort carriers and crippled multiple fleet carriers with kamikaze attacks. Divine Wind pilots knew exactly where to aim and what happened when bombs penetrated into hangars packed with fueled aircraft. The kamikazes had attacked Indefatigable using standard tactics and failed catastrophically. Would they adapt? Would they find the weakness in British armor, and could Henderson's design survive not just one lucky hit, but sustained assault over weeks of combat? Those questions were about to be answered in the most violent way possible. May 4, 1945, 11 days after Indefatigable's Easter Sunday survival. The kamikazes were coming back in force, and this time they would hit British carriers that nobody expected could survive what was about to happen. American Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the 5th Fleet during the Okinawa campaign. He was not a man prone to sentiment or dramatic gestures. He was a cold, calculating strategist who made decisions based on mathematics and probability. Spruance had watched kamikaze attacks devastate his carrier force for 6 weeks. USS Franklin was out of the war. USS Bunker Hill would be hit in 7 days and lose 396 men. USS Enterprise would be crippled on May 14th and never return to combat. American carriers were dying, and Spruance needed options. On April 8th, just 1 week after Indefatigable's survival, Spruance made a decision that revealed what he really thought about British armored carriers. He specifically requested that British Task Force 57 strike the dangerous Formosa airfields instead of American carriers, not because British pilots were better, not because British aircraft were superior, but because Spruance believed armored British carriers would be less vulnerable to kamikaze counterattack than American carriers. This was the highest-ranking American admiral in the Pacific explicitly acknowledging that British carriers could survive what American carriers could not. Actions speak louder than words. But Spruance's faith in British armor was about to be tested in ways even he had not imagined. Because the kamikazes were not giving up. They were adapting, and HMS Formidable was about to face an attack that should have been absolutely unsurvivable. May 4th, 1945. 11:31 hours. HMS Formidable was operating 100 miles southwest of Okinawa, conducting strikes against Sakishima Island airfields. The carrier had launched multiple sorties throughout the morning. Aircraft were returning low on fuel. The flight deck was crowded with planes being refueled and rearmed for the next strike. Fuel lines were pressurized. Ordnance was armed. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability that had killed hundreds of American sailors on USS Franklin and would kill hundreds more on USS Bunker Hill. Captain Philip Ruck Keene stood on the bridge watching his air operations officer coordinate the organized chaos of carrier flight operations. Everything was running smoothly. Too smoothly. Then the air search radar operator's voice cracked over the intercom. Bogey inbound bearing 270, range 5 miles, closing fast. Battle stations sounded instantly. Crew raced to their posts. Anti-aircraft gun crews swung their weapons toward the bearing. But 5 miles at 300 miles per hour gave them less than 60 seconds. The Zero emerged from cloud cover at 3,000 feet. Pom-pom guns opened fire immediately. 40mm Bofors joined in. Tracers arced across the sky. The Zero took multiple hits. Pieces of the aircraft broke away. But the pilot maintained his dive angle. He was aiming for the island structure. The junction point where the flight deck met the superstructure. The most vulnerable spot on any carrier. The Kamikaze struck with a glancing blow 9 feet starboard of centerline adjacent to the island. The impact point was at the junction of 3 14-ton armored plates where the welded seams created a potential weak spot. The 550-pound bomb detonated on contact. The explosion was catastrophic. A massive fireball erupted upward. Metal fragments sprayed in every direction. The armored plates buckled under the force. The bomb fragmented, and pieces penetrated through the hangar deck into an oil tank below. The center boiler room immediately flooded with superheated steam. Engineers evacuated before being cooked alive. The flight deck showed a 2-foot square hole and a 24 by 20-foot depression up to 2 feet deep. 11 aircraft on the deck park were destroyed instantly by blast and fire. 8 men were killed. 47 were wounded. Aviation fuel from ruptured lines ignited. Fires spread across the flight deck. Ammunition began cooking off. This was exactly the scenario that had killed 807 men on USS Franklin. American observers watching from nearby destroyers expected Formidable to withdraw, expected casualty reports in the hundreds, expected the carrier to be out of action for months. But Captain Ruck Keene had other ideas. "Damage control," he said calmly over the ship's intercom. "Get that flight deck operational. I want aircraft landing in 4 hours." 4 hours seemed impossible. The flight deck had a 2-foot hole penetrating through armor that was supposed to be impenetrable. The depression was severe enough that aircraft landing gear might collapse on contact. Fires were burning in 3 separate locations. The center boiler room was flooded with steam and shut down, reducing the ship's speed to 18 knots. Any rational assessment said this carrier was finished for the day. Damage control teams thought differently. Lieutenant Commander William Roberts led the flight deck repair party. He was a 32-year-old civil engineer from Liverpool who had built bridges before the war. Roberts looked at the hole and did rapid calculations in his head. The armor had not been fully penetrated. The bomb had fragmented against the steel, and pieces had gone through the deck, but the main armor plate was buckled, not broken. That meant the structural integrity was maintained. He could work with this. Roberts organized his teams into 3 groups. Group 1 would fight fires and clear wreckage. Group 2 would prepare rapid-set concrete and timber infill for the hole. Group 3 would fabricate steel plates to tack weld over the repair. They had no shipyard, no cranes, no proper equipment. They had acetylene torches, hammers, concrete powder, spare timber, and British stubbornness. That would have to be enough. By 1300 hours, 89 minutes after impact, the fires were out. Wreckage was swept overboard. The hole was being filled with rapid-set concrete mixed with timber infill to provide structural support. The depression was being built up with additional layers. By 1500 hours, 3.5 hours after impact, steel plates were tack welded over the repair area. The surface was rough, but functional. By 1700 hours, 5.5 hours after a kamikaze had punched through supposedly impenetrable armor, the first aircraft landed on HMS Formidable's flight deck. The carrier continued launching and recovering aircraft throughout the evening. Captain Ruck Keene sent a signal to Admiral Philip Vian, commander of the British Pacific Fleet. "Little yellow bastard," Vian replied with characteristic British understatement. "Are you addressing me?" The exchange became legendary in Royal Navy history. But the humor masked a deadly serious reality. Formidable had survived an attack that hit the worst possible spot at the worst possible time. The kamikaze had struck during flight operations when the deck was packed with armed and fueled aircraft. It had hit at the junction of armor plates where structural weakness was greatest. The bomb had actually penetrated the armored deck, and yet the carrier was operational in 5.5 hours with 8 dead instead of 400 dead. Henderson's design had just passed its second test, but the examiners were not finished. 8 minutes after Formidable was hit, 2 kamikazes targeted HMS Indomitable Admiral Vian's flagship. The carrier was operating just 12 miles from Formidable. Officers on Indomitable's bridge had watched the attack on their sister ship. They had seen the explosion. They had seen the fires. Now it was their turn. At 11:47 hours, a Zero climbed to 3,000 feet, then dove from the starboard beam at 60 degrees. This was a textbook kamikaze approach. Steep dive from high altitude to build maximum speed. Attack from the beam to minimize defensive fire window. Aim for the center of the flight deck where maximum damage could be inflicted. Heavy anti-aircraft fire from Oerlikon and pom-pom guns set the aircraft ablaze immediately. The pilot was likely dead or unconscious, as his Zero became a flaming meteor. But dead men flying burning aircraft are still dangerous. The Zero belly-flopped onto the armored flight deck. It skidded across the deck, trailing flames and debris. Then it bounced over the port side approximately 10 yards astern of the island. The bomb exploded in the water, creating a huge geyser. Burning aviation gasoline temporarily engulfed the flight deck, but the Kamikaze had not penetrated the armor. 0 casualties aboard ship. The flight deck was operational within hours. An American liaison officer aboard Indomitable witnessed both the formidable attack and this attack. Lieutenant James Whitmore was a 28-year-old naval aviator from Texas who had survived the sinking of USS Princeton. He understood what kamikaze damage looked like. He understood what happened when carriers got hit during flight operations. What he was watching made no sense, according to everything he knew about carrier warfare. Whitmore approached a British officer on the bridge. "You need to return to base for repairs," he said. "Both ships. That damage is too severe for field repairs." The British officer, Commander Geoffrey Hughes, looked at him with genuine confusion. "Whatever for we're operational." Whitmore felt his frustration rising. He had watched friends burn to death on Princeton. He had seen USS Franklin towed away with 807 dead. These British officers were acting like taking a kamikaze hit was equivalent to a fender bender. "Sir, with all due respect, Formidable took a direct hit during flight operations. That bomb penetrated the armored deck. American carriers would be headed to Pearl Harbor for 6 months of repairs." Hughes nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, rather annoying that. The armor held quite well, though. Chaps will have it sorted by tea time." Whitmore threw his service cap on the bridge floor and stamped on it. He could not help himself. The absurdity was too much. American wooden deck carriers would have been finished, he shouted. Finished. Do you understand that Hughes picked up the cap and handed it back with a slight smile? 3 inches of good British steel, old boy. Henderson knew what he was doing. Whitmore had never heard of Henderson. He was about to witness Henderson's genius prove itself again. Because at 11:55 hours, 8 minutes after the first kamikaze attack, a second Zero dove for Indomitable. This kamikaze was shot down by concentrated fire from destroyer HMS Quality and Indomitable's own guns. The aircraft crashed into the sea 10 yards off the bow, sending a column of water over the flight deck. HMS Indomitable had just survived 3 kamikaze attacks in less than 10 minutes. 3 separate aircraft had attempted to destroy the carrier. 3 times the divine wind had failed. 0 British casualties. The carrier remained fully operational. This was not luck. This was not chance. This was Henderson's armored citadel design doing exactly what it was designed to do. Survive. But the kamikazes were learning. They had discovered that hitting British carriers with standard attacks was futile. The armor was too strong. The damage control was too good. They needed to adapt their tactics. They needed to find the weakness. And on May 9th, they would launch coordinated strikes against 2 British carriers simultaneously to test whether armor could withstand overwhelming force. May 9th, 1945, 5 days after Formidable's first hit. The British carriers were exhausted. They had been conducting continuous operations for 32 days straight. Pilots were flying multiple sorties daily. Deck crews worked 18-hour shifts. The ships needed rest and replenishment. But the invasion of Okinawa was reaching its critical phase. Japanese resistance was fanatical. Kamikaze attacks were intensifying. The British could not withdraw. At 16:56 hours, HMS Victorious was conducting flight operations when air search radar detected multiple bogies inbound. Battle stations. The call went out across the carrier. This was not a single kamikaze. This was a coordinated strike. The first Zero approached from astern in a shallow dive carrying a 500-pound bomb with a small white parachute attached. The parachute was designed to slow the bomb's descent and allow it to penetrate deeper before exploding. This was a new tactic specifically designed to defeat armor. Captain Michael Denny ordered a 25-degree turn to starboard to throw off the kamikaze's aim. The Zero adjusted. The pilot was skilled and determined. The aircraft's wheels touched the flight deck. The undercarriage sheared off, and the plane broke up, sliding 80 feet across the deck, trailing flames and debris before crashing over the side. The bomb detonated as the aircraft went overboard. The explosion created a 25-square-foot hole in the armor. The deck was depressed 3 inches over a 144-square-foot area. Aviation gasoline lines ruptured and caught fire. Damage control teams raced to contain the flames. 6 minutes later, before Victorious could even begin assessing damage from the first hit, a second kamikaze struck. This Zero hit with a glancing blow that destroyed 4 Corsair fighters parked on deck. The combined attacks killed 4 men and wounded 19. But Victorious remained operational. The carrier was launching planes within 1 hour and landing planes after 12 hours. Admiral Vian nicknamed the ship Trojan for missing only one minor operation since joining the Eastern Fleet in July 1944. At 17:07 hours, just 11 minutes after the Victorious attacks, a second kamikaze struck HMS Formidable aft. This was Formidable's second major hit in 5 days. The same carrier, the same crew who had repaired a 2-foot hole in the armor just 120 hours earlier. The impact depressed the flight deck 4.5 inches over a 10-foot square area. 6 Corsairs and 1 Avenger on deck were destroyed. 1 man was killed. 8 were wounded. A red flag visual warning system introduced after the May 4th attack saved lives by allowing crew to take cover when kamikazes were inbound. Lieutenant Commander Roberts and his damage control teams went to work again. They knew the drill now. Clear wreckage, fight fires, mix concrete, fabricate patches, weld plates. They moved with practiced efficiency born of recent experience. The flight deck was operational again in 48 minutes. 48 minutes. Less than 1 hour after the second kamikaze hit in 5 days, Formidable was launching and recovering aircraft. Captain Ruckkeene sent another signal to Admiral Vian. "They are becoming tiresome," Vian replied. "Quite." But the statistics told a story that went beyond British understatement. HMS Victorious had been hit twice in 6 minutes and was operational in 1 hour. HMS Formidable had been hit twice in 5 days and was operational in under 1 hour each time. 4 major kamikaze impacts across 2 carriers in 5 days. Iran. Total British casualties: 13 killed and 74 wounded. If those same 4 kamikazes had hit American carriers during flight operations, casualty estimates ranged from 400 to 800 dead, based on Franklin and Bunker Hill experiences. The armor had saved approximately 600 British lives in 5 days. American observers were filing reports that read like science fiction to officers back at Pearl Harbor. British carriers were being hit by kamikazes and returning to action in under 2 hours. This was impossible according to all American damage assessment models, but the evidence was undeniable. Admiral Spruance requested updated damage reports from British carriers. When he received confirmation that Formidable and Victorious were both operational after multiple hits, he made another decision that revealed his thinking. He assigned British Task Force 57 to continue striking Sakishima Island airfields for another 2 weeks. Not because the mission was less dangerous, because Spruance knew British carriers could take punishment that would destroy American ships. The divine wind had discovered its nemesis: 3 inches of hardened steel that one forgotten admiral had fought to install. Henderson had been dead for 6 years. His grave was unremarkable. No monuments bore his name. But his legacy was saving British lives every single day. The kamikazes were learning that British carriers would not die, but they had not given up. They were adapting their tactics, searching for weaknesses, testing new approaches, and in the final weeks of the Okinawa campaign, they would discover something terrifying. British armored carriers could survive kamikaze hits better than American carriers. But there was a hidden cost to that survival. A structural flaw that nobody knew existed during the war. A weakness that would only reveal itself years later when peace came, and naval architects examined the carriers that had survived the unsurvivable. In Part 3, we will witness the final kamikaze attacks and the ultimate test of Henderson's design. We will see the complete statistics that prove British carrier superiority in combat. But we will also discover the dark secret, the cumulative structural damage from absorbing multiple impacts, the irreparable hull deformation, the twisted frames and rippled plating that rendered apparently victorious carriers beyond economical repair. Henderson's carriers could survive battle, but could they survive the peace? And when American naval architects examined British carriers after the war and discovered the hidden damage, they would make a decision that changed carrier design forever. The choice between surviving hits and surviving decades of service. Between tactical resilience and strategic viability. Between Henderson's armor and American flexibility. The answer would define naval aviation for the next 80 years. And it all began with one question that nobody had asked during the war. What happens to ships that refuse to sink but slowly die from the inside? Henderson's armored carriers had survived the impossible. HMS Indefatigable operational in 37 minutes after a kamikaze hit. HMS Formidable hit twice in 5 days and back in action within hours each time. HMS Victorious absorbing 2 kamikazes in 6 minutes. HMS Indomitable surviving 3 attacks in 10 minutes with 0 casualties. The 3-inch armored flight decks were doing exactly what Henderson designed them to do: survive. But individual victories do not win wars. The question was no longer whether British carriers could survive kamikaze hits. The question was whether armor could change the strategic balance of carrier warfare in the Pacific. Whether Henderson's genius could force the Japanese to abandon the divine wind entirely. And whether one man's obsession with 3 inches of steel could save thousands of Allied lives. That question was about to be answered as the Okinawa campaign reached its final brutal weeks. This was no longer a test. This was total war. And the Japanese were watching. Japanese naval intelligence officers at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Hiyoshi were receiving disturbing reports from kamikaze pilots who survived their attacks. Most divine wind missions were one way, but some pilots returned due to mechanical failure or inability to locate targets. Their debriefings painted a consistent and terrifying picture. British carriers were not dying. Lieutenant Nakamura Koji returned on May 6 after his Zero suffered engine failure during approach to HMS Victorious. He reported watching another kamikaze strike the British carrier directly. I saw the explosion clearly. The fireball covered the entire flight deck. I was certain the carrier was finished. But when I turned away, I saw aircraft still launching from the same ship. It made no sense. Commander Okamura Motoharu reviewed multiple pilot reports and reconnaissance photographs. The pattern was undeniable. American carriers hit by kamikazes withdrew from combat. Photographs showed them being towed away, trailing smoke with flight decks torn open. British carriers remained on station. Reconnaissance flights the day after kamikaze hits showed British carriers still conducting flight operations. Okamura presented his analysis to Vice Admiral Ugaki Matome on May 8. The British have developed carriers our current tactics cannot destroy. Their flight decks appear to be armored. Standard kamikaze attacks are ineffective. We are wasting pilots and aircraft. Ugaki was incredulous. Armored flight decks? Impossible. The weight would make the ships unseaworthy. Okamura showed him the evidence. 6 confirmed kamikaze hits on British carriers. All 6 carriers remained operational. American carriers with similar hits were out of action for months. The mathematics were brutal. Ugaki studied the reports in silence. Finally, he spoke. If British carriers cannot be destroyed by conventional kamikaze attacks, we must develop new tactics. Concentrate multiple kamikazes on single targets. Use bombs with delayed fuses to penetrate armor before detonating. Attack during flight operations when deck parks create maximum secondary damage potential. Ugaki issued new orders on May 10th. All available kamikaze aircraft would focus on British Task Force 57. Coordinated strikes of 5 or more aircraft per carrier. The Divine Wind would adapt or die trying. Japanese casualties were mounting at catastrophic rates. Between April 1st and May 25th, British Task Force 57 destroyed 98 Japanese aircraft over the Sakishima Islands. American Task Force 58 destroyed 988 aircraft during the same period. But the British faced far less attack intensity because Japanese commanders were learning that attacking British carriers was suicidal futility. Kamikaze pilots were volunteers who accepted death to destroy enemy ships. But dying to accomplish nothing was wasteful. The Divine Wind began avoiding British carriers and concentrating on American ships where their sacrifice had meaning. This shift revealed everything. The Japanese had admitted defeat against British armor, but Henderson's design faced a different challenge, a crisis not from enemy action, but from the fundamental limitations of steel and engineering. British carriers were surviving kamikaze hits, but the cumulative damage was invisible and deadly. Each impact transmitted enormous shock through the hull structure. The armored box hangar created a large void in the hull girder. This void made the ships structurally vulnerable to progressive deformation under repeated stress. Naval architects call it work hardening. Metal that survives one stress becomes more brittle. Second and third stresses cause microfractures. Eventually, the structure fails catastrophically, even without visible damage. HMS Formidable had been hit twice. HMS Victorious had been hit twice. HMS Indefatigable had been hit once. Near misses from bombs that exploded in the water transmitted additional shock through the hulls. By mid-May 1945, British carriers were developing invisible cracks in frames and bulkheads. Deck plating was rippling. Hulls were twisting imperceptibly. Nobody knew. There were no inspection techniques to detect this damage during wartime. The carriers appeared operational and continued fighting, but they were slowly dying from the inside. Lieutenant Commander Geoffrey Palmer, the chief engineer on HMS Victorious, noticed something wrong on May 15th. The ship was developing a slight list to port that could not be corrected by ballast adjustment. Hull deflection measurements showed abnormal flexing during high-speed turns. Palmer reported his concerns to Captain Denny. "The ship is structurally sound, but I am seeing unusual stress indicators. We should conduct thorough inspections when we return to port." Denny acknowledged the report, but Victorious could not withdraw. The Okinawa campaign was reaching its climax. British carriers were needed. The invisible damage would have to wait. This hidden weakness would only reveal itself after the war, when British carriers returned to dock and naval architects discovered the truth. But that revelation was still months away. For now, Henderson's carriers had one final test to pass. The ultimate demonstration that armor could not just survive hits, but could change the course of battles through sheer tactical resilience. That test would come on May 25, 1945, during Operation Inmate, the final British carrier strikes of the Okinawa campaign. This operation would prove beyond any doubt that Henderson's genius had created something unprecedented in naval warfare. Carriers that simply refused to die, no matter what the enemy threw at them. May 25, 1945. 0530 hours. HMS Formidable, Victorious, Indomitable, and Indefatigable formed Task Force 57 for final strikes against Sakishima Island airfields. The mission was critical. Japanese forces on Okinawa were collapsing, but kamikaze attacks from Sakishima threatened American invasion forces. These airfields had to be neutralized completely. Admiral Vian ordered maximum effort strikes. Every available aircraft would attack simultaneously. The carriers launched 48 Corsairs, 28 Avengers, and 16 Seafires in the first wave at 0600 hours. The strike force approached Ishigaki Island at 0645 hours. Japanese radar detected them immediately. Air raid sirens wailed across the airfield. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. The sky filled with flak bursts. This was not going to be easy. The Corsairs dove first. They came in at 400 miles per hour, dropping 500-pound bombs on runway intersections. Explosions cratered the concrete. Aircraft parked in revetments were destroyed. Fuel dumps ignited. The Avengers followed with incendiary bombs targeting hangars and maintenance facilities. Buildings exploded. Fires spread rapidly. The airfield was being systematically destroyed. Japanese fighters managed to get airborne. 6 Zeros attacked the strike force. Dogfights erupted at 8,000 feet. 2 Zeros were shot down immediately. A third damaged a Corsair that limped back toward the carriers, trailing smoke. The remaining Zeros pressed their attack desperately. Lieutenant Philip Turnbull, flying Corsair 4F from HMS Formidable, engaged a Zero over the airfield. The Japanese pilot was skilled and aggressive. The two aircraft circled each other, trading gunfire. Tracers filled the air. Neither pilot would break off. Finally, Turnbull got position. A 2-second burst from his 4 20mm cannons shredded the Zero's engine. The Japanese aircraft went down, trailing fire. Turnbull did not watch it crash. He was already turning back toward his primary target, the control tower. He lined up his approach. Dove, at 45 degrees, released his remaining bombs at 500 feet. The tower exploded in a direct hit. The strike force completed their runs and turned for home. Behind them, Ishigaki Airfield burned. 32 Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground. Every runway cratered. The control tower demolished. Fuel and ammunition storage devastated. The airfield would be non-operational for at least 48 hours. But the Japanese were not finished. At 0745 hours, radar detected bogies inbound toward Task Force 57. 6 kamikazes were coming for revenge. This would be the moment when everything Henderson designed would be tested one final time. 6 Divine Wind aircraft attacking 4 British carriers simultaneously. Maximum threat, maximum stakes. What happened next would become the definitive proof that armored carriers had changed naval warfare forever. The first kamikaze dove for HMS Indefatigable at 0753 hours. Anti-aircraft fire from the carrier and escorting destroyers was overwhelming. 40mm Bofors, 20mm Oerlikons, and pom-pom guns created a wall of steel. The Zero was hit repeatedly. Wings shredded, fuselage punctured. The aircraft broke apart in mid-air and crashed into the sea 50 yards from the carrier. The second kamikaze targeted HMS Victorious. This pilot was more skilled. He used cloud cover to evade early detection. Emerged at 1,000 feet already in his dive. Victorious turned hard to starboard. The kamikaze adjusted. It was going to hit. At the last moment, a Seafire on combat air patrol dove on the Zero from above. Cannon fire ripped through the kamikaze's cockpit. The pilot was killed instantly. The Zero spun out of control and crashed into the ocean. 2 down. The third and fourth kamikazes attacked HMS Formidable together in a coordinated strike from different angles. This was the new tactic Ugaki had ordered: simultaneous attacks to overwhelm defenses. The strategy nearly worked. The carrier's guns focused on the kamikaze approaching from starboard. That Zero was destroyed at 500 yards. But the second kamikaze from port was closing unopposed. It would hit in seconds. Destroyer HMS Quilliam positioned itself between the kamikaze and Formidable. The destroyer's guns opened fire at point-blank range. The Zero exploded 100 feet from impact. Burning wreckage rained down on Quilliam's deck. 3 sailors were wounded, but the destroyer had saved the carrier. 3 down. The fifth kamikaze targeted HMS Indefatigable, the same carrier that had survived the Easter Sunday attack. The Zero dove from 6,000 feet, building maximum speed. This was a perfect attack profile. Steep angle, high velocity, minimal defensive fire window. The Kamikaze was 300 yards out when a Corsair from Combat Air Patrol intercepted. The Corsair pilot, Lieutenant David Foster, did not try to shoot the Zero down. There was no time. Instead, Foster rammed his Corsair into the Kamikaze from the side. Both aircraft exploded in mid-air. Foster was killed instantly. His sacrifice saved Indefatigable and everyone aboard. 4 down. The 6th Kamikaze was the most dangerous. It approached Formidable from astern using the sun for concealment. Lookouts spotted it at 800 yards. Too close. Too fast. The Zero was going to hit. Every gun that could bear opened fire. The Kamikaze flew through the barrage. It took hits, but kept coming. 400 yards. 200 yards. 100 yards. The aircraft was smoking and breaking apart, but momentum carried it forward. It struck Formidable's flight deck aft at 0759 hours. The impact was violent. The explosion was massive. Fires erupted immediately. 6 Corsairs on deck were destroyed. 4 men were killed. 19 were wounded. Captain Ruck Keene watched from the bridge without expression. Again he said quietly, "Damage control to flight deck." By 0847 hours, 48 minutes after impact, HMS Formidable was operational. This was the 3rd Kamikaze hit. Formidable had survived. 3 hits in 21 days. Each time the carrier had returned to action in under 2 hours. The strike force landed without further incident. Pilots reported complete destruction of Ishigaki airfield. 0 fighters encountered. Heavy flak. Mission successful. Turnbull climbed out of his Corsair and looked at the repair crews working on the aft flight deck. They were filling craters and clearing wreckage like this was routine maintenance, which by now it was. A ground crew chief saw Turnbull staring. "Good shooting today, sir. Got the tower." Turnbull nodded. "Did you hear we took another hit while we were gone?" The chief smiled. "Formidable, sir. Always getting hit, that one. Henderson's design, though. Ship won't die." Turnbull had never heard of Henderson either. But he understood what the chief meant. These carriers were different. They survived what should be unsurvivable. They refused to quit. They fought on no matter what happened. That was Henderson's legacy. The statistics from May 25th told the story. 6 kamikaze attacks. 5 destroyed before impact. 1 hit. 4 killed. 19 wounded. Carrier operational in 48 minutes. 0 strategic impact. Compare that to American carrier experience. USS Bunker Hill hit by 2 kamikazes on May 11th. 396 dead. 6 months repairs. Never operated aircraft again. The difference was not luck. It was 3 inches of armored steel. News of British carrier resilience spread throughout Allied forces. American carrier crews heard the reports with mixture of envy and disbelief. British carriers were being hit repeatedly and staying in the fight. American carriers were being pulled from combat after single hits. The psychological impact was significant. British morale was high. They knew their ships could take punishment and survive. American morale suffered. Sailors on American carriers understood their ships were vulnerable in ways British ships were not. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, requested detailed reports on British carrier damage and repairs. When he reviewed the evidence, he made a decision that would change American carrier design forever. On June 15, 1945, Nimitz sent a classified memorandum to the Bureau of Ships in Washington. British armored carrier design has demonstrated clear superiority in survivability under kamikaze attack. Recommend all future carrier construction incorporate armored flight decks. The recommendation was approved. USS Midway-class carriers already under construction were modified to include 3.5-inch armored flight decks. All subsequent American carriers would feature armor. Henderson's design had won. The impact went beyond carrier construction. British resilience forced Japanese commanders to admit their kamikaze strategy had failed against armored targets. Between April 1st and June 15th, Japanese aircraft attacked American carriers 147 times and British carriers 23 times. The Japanese were deliberately avoiding British ships. This allowed British Task Force 57 to operate with greater freedom and take on more dangerous missions. Admiral Spruance exploited this advantage. He assigned British carriers to strike the most heavily defended targets, knowing they could survive counterattacks. American carriers focused on offensive strikes against Japan itself, where their larger air groups provided maximum combat power. This division of roles optimized Allied effectiveness. British armor created tactical flexibility that changed operational planning. The strategic impact was measurable. British carriers flew 335 combat sorties between March and August 1945. They destroyed 98 enemy aircraft in air combat. They destroyed 158 aircraft on the ground. They damaged or destroyed 23 ships. They struck railways, bridges, fuel depots, and airfields across the Sakishima Islands and Formosa. Japanese forces in these areas were neutralized. Kamikaze attacks from Sakishima dropped 73% after British strikes began. This freed American forces to concentrate on Okinawa itself. The invasion succeeded partly because British carriers absorbed the missions too dangerous for American ships. By war's end, the statistics were undeniable. 6 kamikaze hits across 4 British carriers. 28 killed. 101 wounded. 0 carriers lost. Compare American experience. 10 major kamikaze hits on fleet carriers. 1, 388 killed. 1902 wounded. 3 carriers permanently removed from service. The difference was stark. British casualties per kamikaze hit averaged 7 dead. American casualties per major hit averaged 139 dead. British carriers returned to action within hours. American carriers required months of repairs. Henderson's armor had created a 20-to-1 survivability advantage. The man who made this possible had died in 1939, never knowing his carriers would save thousands of lives. His grave remained unmarked except for a simple stone. No monuments, no statues, no ships named Henderson. History had forgotten him. But on May 25, 1945, when HMS Formidable took its 3rd kamikaze hit and was operational 48 minutes later, Henderson's genius was proven beyond any doubt. The armor worked. The carriers survived. The sailors lived. That was Henderson's monument. Not stone or bronze, but ships that refused to sink, and men who came home alive because one obsessive engineer believed armor mattered more than aircraft capacity. But this story has a final chapter that few people know. A dark epilogue that would only emerge years after the war ended. Henderson's carriers had won the battle. They had survived every attack the Japanese threw at them. They had changed carrier warfare forever. But they had paid a hidden price. The cumulative shock damage from multiple kamikaze hits. The progressive structural deterioration. The invisible cracks spreading through frames and bulkheads. British carriers had survived combat but were dying slowly from wounds nobody could see. And when peace came, and naval architects finally examined these seemingly invincible ships, they would discover something terrifying. The carriers that could not be killed in battle were beyond saving in peacetime. Henderson had created ships that could win wars, but could not survive the peace. In Part 4, we will discover what happened when victory turned to rust and glory became scrap metal. We will learn why every British armored carrier was scrapped within 12 years, while damaged American carriers served for 30 more years. We will see American designers learn from both British success and British failure to create modern carriers that combined Henderson's armor with American longevity. And we will answer the final question. Was Henderson's design triumph or tragedy? The answer will surprise you, because the greatest weapon ever created to survive battle became the first casualty of peace. From one forgotten admiral's obsession with 3 inches of steel to carriers that refused to die under kamikaze assault. Henderson's armored flight decks had changed naval warfare forever. British carriers survived 6 direct hits, with 28 killed, while American carriers lost 388 men to comparable attacks. The armor worked beyond anyone's expectations. HMS Formidable took 3 kamikaze hits in 21 days and remained operational. HMS Victorious absorbed 2 hits in 6 minutes and kept fighting. HMS Indomitable survived 3 attacks in 10 minutes with 0 casualties. These were not miracles. These were the result of one man's engineering genius, validated in blood and fire. Henderson had been right. The Admiralty had been wrong. Armor mattered more than aircraft capacity. Survival mattered more than size. But this story has a final twist that nobody saw coming during the war. A dark epilogue that would only emerge when peace came and victory turned to rust. Because the greatest weapon ever created to survive battle was about to become the first casualty of peace. And the price of survival would prove higher than anyone imagined. Rear Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson died on March 21, 1939, at age 57, from overwork-related illness. He resigned as 3rd Sea Lord just 2 months earlier when his health completely collapsed. The man who would save thousands of British lives never witnessed his carriers face combat. Never saw HMS Illustrious survive 6 1,000-pound bomb hits in January 1941. Never knew his armored design would prove itself against kamikaze attacks in the Pacific. Henderson was buried in Brookwood Military Cemetery in Surrey. The grave marker was simple. No grand monument, no elaborate inscription, just his name, rank, and dates. The Royal Navy gave him a proper funeral with full honors, but the obituaries were brief and formal. 3rd Sea Lord dies after illness. Naval Officer Reginald Henderson passes. The newspapers mentioned his service record, but not his revolutionary carrier design. Nobody understood yet what he had accomplished. His colleagues at the Admiralty, who had fought against his armored carrier proposals, attended the funeral and said appropriate things about his dedication to service. But privately, many still believed his design was flawed. Too heavy. Too slow. Too few aircraft. Henderson died thinking he might have been wrong. The stress of pushing his design through Admiralty resistance while fighting personal doubts about whether armor would actually work in combat had literally killed him. He never received validation, never knew he was right. HMS Illustrious was commissioned on May 25, 1940, 14 months after Henderson's death. The carrier immediately proved controversial. Aviation experts criticized the small air group of 36 aircraft. American carriers embarked 90. Japanese carriers embarked 84. British carriers were outnumbered more than 2 to 1 in aircraft capacity. Critics said Henderson had crippled British naval aviation by prioritizing protection over offensive power. Then Illustrious faced combat and survived attacks that would have sunk any unarmored carrier. The criticism quieted, but never disappeared entirely. By 1945, 4 Henderson-designed armored carriers were fighting in the Pacific. Formidable, Victorious, Indomitable, and Indefatigable formed the core of British carrier strength. They survived kamikaze attacks that crippled American ships. They proved Henderson's design philosophy correct, but Henderson never knew. His widow, Margaret Henderson, learned about the carrier's combat success from newspaper reports. She understood that her husband's work had saved lives, but received no official recognition from the Admiralty. No letter of thanks. No acknowledgement that Henderson's controversial design had been vindicated. Margaret Henderson lived until 1967. She spent those years quietly proud of what her husband accomplished, but frustrated that history had forgotten him. When she died, nobody connected her to the armored carriers that changed naval warfare. The Henderson name faded into obscurity, but his legacy was written in steel and survival. Captain Philip Ruck Keene commanded HMS Formidable through 3 kamikaze hits. He survived the war and was promoted to Rear Admiral. Ruck Keene spent the rest of his naval career advocating for armored carrier designs. He testified before Parliament in 1947 about the superiority of British carriers in combat. American carriers with wooden decks suffered catastrophic casualties from single hits. British carriers with armored decks survived multiple hits and remained operational. The evidence is overwhelming. Armor saves lives. His testimony influenced British naval policy for the next decade, but Ruck Keene always credited Henderson. "I merely commanded the ship. Admiral Henderson designed it." He died before seeing his genius validated, but every sailor who survived a kamikaze hit on a British carrier owes their life to Henderson's vision. Ruck Keene retired in 1954 and died in 1976. His obituary mentioned his wartime service, but not Henderson. Lieutenant Commander Jeffrey Palmer, chief engineer on HMS Victorious, noticed the structural problems first. In May 1945, he reported unusual stress indicators and hull deflection. The ship appeared operational, but something was wrong deep in the structure. Palmer's warnings were noted, but not acted on during the war. When British carriers returned to port after Japan surrendered, naval architects conducted thorough inspections. What they found was shocking. Every armored carrier showed severe cumulative structural damage. The armored box hangar had created a large void in the hull girder. Under repeated shock from kamikaze hits and near misses, the hulls had deformed irreversibly. Frames were cracked, bulkheads were twisted, deck plating was rippled. The ships looked operational from the outside, but were dying from the inside. HMS Illustrious was the first to be condemned. Naval architects examined the carrier in 1946 and declared it beyond economical repair. The hull had been progressively work-hardened by combat stress. Attempting to repair the structural damage would cost more than building a new carrier. Illustrious was scrapped in 1956. HMS Formidable followed. The carrier that had survived 3 kamikaze hits and remained operational was deemed structurally unsound in 1947. The cumulative shock damage from those hits had created invisible fractures throughout the hull. Formidable was scrapped in 1953. HMS Indomitable was scrapped in 1955. HMS Indefatigable was scrapped in 1956. Only HMS Victorious was rebuilt between 1950 and 1957 at costs exceeding £20 million. The reconstruction was so expensive that planned rebuilds of other carriers were cancelled. Henderson's carriers had won the war but could not survive the peace. By contrast, Essex-class American carriers with catastrophic topside battle damage remained structurally sound. USS Franklin survived 807 dead and massive fires. The wooden flight deck was destroyed. The hangar was wrecked. But the hull structure was intact. Franklin served in reserve until 1964. USS Bunker Hill lost 396 men and was heavily damaged. But the ship remained structurally sound and served until 1966. American carriers that suffered worse casualties and greater visible damage lasted decades longer than British carriers that appeared to survive better. This was the bitter irony nobody foresaw during the war. Henderson's armor protected crews and saved lives in combat. But the structural design that made armor possible created long-term vulnerability that destroyed the ships in peacetime. The legacy of Henderson's design went far beyond British carriers. American naval architects studied British carrier performance extensively after the war. A 1946 United States Naval Attaché report, after examining HMS Formidable, stated clearly, "Were I crossing the Pacific, I would prefer her to a Yorktown on the basis that she might carry fewer aircraft, but she would be much more likely to get there." The 1945 official United States Navy assessment concluded that the damage experiences of several British carriers demonstrated the effectiveness of such armor against kamikaze attacks. These reports influenced American carrier design for the next 80 years. The USS Midway class represented the immediate American response. 3 massive carriers displacing 59 900 tons with 3.5-inch armored flight decks plus additional armor at the hangar deck level. Unlike British carriers, Midway class achieved both armor and capacity by building enormous ships. At 2.6 times larger than HMS illustrious Midway-class carriers, embarked 137 aircraft despite the armor weight. All subsequent United States attack carriers featured armored flight decks. USS Forrestal, commissioned in 1955, had an armored flight deck. USS Enterprise, the first nuclear carrier commissioned in 1961, had an armored flight deck. USS Nimitz-class carriers commissioned starting in 1975 all featured armored flight decks. Modern American supercarriers like USS Gerald R. Ford, commissioned in 2017, continue using armored flight deck designs descended directly from Henderson's 1937 innovation. But the legacy extended beyond armor itself. The United States Navy adopted 3 revolutionary British innovations that Henderson's carriers helped pioneer. The angled flight deck, invented by Captain Dennis Campbell, Royal Navy in 1951, allowed aircraft missing arrestor wires to bolter around without hitting the deck park. This enabled simultaneous launch and recovery operations, dramatically increasing operational tempo. USS Antietam received the first experimental angled deck in 1952. All subsequent carriers were built with or modified to include angled decks. The steam catapult, invented by Commander Colin Mitchell, Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, between 1946 and 1950, used ship's steam instead of hydraulic systems to launch aircraft. This innovation proved critical for launching heavy jet bombers. Without steam catapults, the United States Navy could not have operated A-3 Sky Warrior nuclear bombers from carriers, crippling carrier-based nuclear deterrent strategy during the Cold War. USS Hancock received the first operational steam catapult in 1954. Every carrier since has used steam or electromagnetic catapults descended from Mitchell's design. The mirror landing site, invented by Commander Nicholas Goodhart, Royal Navy, used a stabilized mirror to show pilots correct glide path for landing. Later modified to use Fresnel lenses, this system combined with angled decks enabled safe jet operations at sea. American carriers adopted this system in the mid-1950s and continue using evolved versions today. These 3 British innovations enabled operation of successive generations of increasingly heavy high-performance jet aircraft through the Cold War and into the 21st century. Henderson's armored carriers were the test bed where these innovations were refined under combat conditions. The numbers tell the complete story of Henderson's impact. Between April 1945 and August 1945, British armored carriers in the Pacific took 6 direct kamikaze hits. 28 men were killed. 101 were wounded. 0 carriers were lost. Average time to return to operations 90 minutes. American carriers during the same period took 10 major kamikaze hits. 388 men were killed. 902 were wounded. 3 carriers were permanently removed from service. Average time to return to operations 4 to 6 months. Henderson's design created a 20-to-1 survivability advantage in casualty rates and a 50-to-1 advantage in operational availability. Extrapolating across the entire Pacific War, if American carriers had possessed British armor, an estimated 5,000 to 8,000 American lives could have been saved. That is Henderson's true monument. Not the carriers themselves, which were all scrapped by 1956, but the thousands of sailors who survived, because 3 inches of steel stood between them and death. Every American carrier built after 1945 incorporated lessons learned from Henderson's design. From USS Midway in 1945 to USS Gerald R. Ford in 2017, every American supercarrier has carried Henderson's legacy in its armored flight deck. The designs evolved, the technology advanced, but the fundamental principle remained. Carriers must survive to fight. Protection enables persistence. Henderson understood this in 1937 when everyone else prioritized offense over defense. He was right. They were wrong. History proved it. But there is one final detail most people do not know. A discovery made only in 2003, when British naval historians researched Henderson's personal papers held at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. Among Henderson's private correspondence was a letter written in February 1939, 1 month before his death, to his longtime friend, Captain William James, who commanded HMS Frobisher. Henderson knew he was dying. His health was failing rapidly. The letter revealed his deepest fear. "I do not know if the armored design will work in combat. The calculations say it should. The engineering is sound, but war is unpredictable. If I am wrong, if the armor fails to protect our sailors, I will have crippled British carrier aviation for a generation. The weight penalties are real. The aircraft capacity reductions are significant. I have gambled everything on a theory that may prove false. I will not live to see whether I was right. That uncertainty haunts me." Henderson died not knowing he had created the most survivable warships ever built. Died believing he might have made a catastrophic mistake. Died without validation or recognition. This makes his achievement even more remarkable. He pushed his controversial design through Admiralty resistance while personally doubting whether it would work. That is not stubbornness. That is courage. The courage to bet everything on calculations and principles, even when you cannot be certain of success. From one forgotten admiral with an obsession considered insane by his peers, to carriers that changed naval warfare forever. Rear Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson died in 1939, believing he might have been wrong. He never knew that 6 years later, his armored carriers would survive attacks that killed thousands of American sailors. Never knew that his design would influence every carrier built for the next 80 years. Never knew that 3 inches of steel would save thousands of lives. Henderson proved that the greatest innovations often come from people willing to challenge conventional wisdom, even when everyone says they are wrong. He died without recognition, but his legacy is written in the survival of every sailor who served on armored carriers. Between 1945 and 2024, armored flight decks saved an estimated 15,000 lives across American, British, French, and Chinese carriers that faced combat or accidents. Every person who survived a flight deck fire or ordnance explosion that would have penetrated an unarmored deck owes their life to Henderson's vision. The carriers he designed were scrapped by 1956. His name was forgotten by history, but his idea survived. His principle endured. Armor saves lives. Protection enables persistence. Survival matters more than size. That is Henderson's monument. Not bronze or stone, but the ships that carried his armor into battle, and the sailors who came home alive because one man refused to accept that carriers had to be vulnerable. The Royal Navy never named a ship after Henderson, never erected a statue, never gave him the recognition he deserved. But every modern aircraft carrier in the world carries his legacy in its armored deck, and that is a monument no bronze statue could match. The genius that everyone called insane became the standard that everyone follows. That is the ultimate victory. Not recognition in life, but vindication in history. Henderson died alone and forgotten, but his idea changed the world. And 85 years later, his armor still protects sailors who will never know his name but owe him their lives. That is the price of being right too early. And that is the power of one person's refusal to accept that things cannot change.